Today, Brazil is home to capoeira, which is a martial art but also covers a type of dance, performance, and game. It originally came from Angola. Like many martial arts in the Caribbean, South America, and the United States, there is Angolan and West African influences that survive in these places, whether it be unarmed combat, stick, or knife fighting, etc. This video will provide a brief summary on how this came to be, and how the original tradition from Angola, Ungolo, became evident in these places and changed. Before I begin, for people who want more information, I highly recommend a book by Dr. Desh Obi called Fighting for Honor, The History of African Martial Arts in the Atlantic World, which this video will be based on, albeit in a shorter form. All quotes are from this book, and if you want to know more information, buy it. It's a great book. Before I begin, there is also Meringue in Madagascar, however, there is not much information on it. It works similarly to both damier and capoeira, and may have been the result of a large amount of Angolan slaves being sent to the island. However, this is conjecture. Ungolo originally came from Africa and consists of a play/dance between two people that emphasizes walking on the hands, kicks, grappling, palm strikes, slaps, and headbutts. However, in this context, the moves are playful and conducted in a circle of participants who observe the dance happening, which has religious reasons as well, that's linked to the Central and West African beliefs. There are several factors of how Ungolo came to exist in a form that it had been stated. It is difficult to trace the tradition to its date of origin, however it's believed to have begun with the introduction of cattle in the region, which began around 1000 AD. The reason for this is important because many moves committed in Ungolo, such as headbutting, were emulated from the type of cattle that was farmed, as cattle would headbutt each other when fighting. Kicks and aerobatic evasiveness were emulated from zebras, who were a symbol of nimbleness and were adept at speed, strength, reflexes, and agility. Mainly, the development was due to Central African religious beliefs. Put simply, there is both the physical world which we inhabit and an inverted ancestor world which is inhabited by ancestors, the Kalunga. This was represented by a bridge, in some cases physically such as with the Atlantic Ocean, and it was possible for the bridge to manifest itself and make direct contact with ancestors who lived hundreds of years ago. To do so was to emulate the afterlife which, according to Central African beliefs, was inverted to the land of the living. To live in the afterlife was not to walk on one's feet, but on one's hands. Therefore, it meant moving on one's hands and emphasizing kicks. In the ceremony where a person was initiated, they would be surrounded by others and perform in a circle with a more experienced person. If they were said to be very good, it was believed that they became possessed by an ancestor in the past who was talented at Ungolo, and therefore it would seem the person automatically became skilled at their dance, strikes, and plays, exhibiting moves they never normally exhibited. Deception, dodging, as well as cunning, also played a key role when it came to Central African beliefs, and therefore the dance was also a means to express that. Being a dance, it was able to provide an environment where both people would dance and suddenly one would strike the other and the other would have to react by dodging, using aerobic ability and transferring that to a reply, which is what was called a question and answer. It provided a chance for the person throwing the hit to assess their opponent's reaction and gauge the type of opponent they were facing. Though Ngolo had martial elements, it's important to emphasize it is a dance and a play between two opponents. How rough that play is can vary, and oftentimes being physically tough between both opponents. The people who practiced were most likely grown to be warriors, and in a lot of cases cattle farmers. While overseeing their cattle, to pass the time they would practice forms of martial arts, dodging out of the way of cattle charging, and jumping over them. The types of fighting practice were slap boxing, stick fighting, and stick throwing, all of these coined kadenka. Kicking, headbutting, and wrestling, and ngolo as a pastime, were also done between growing males. These provided a good foundation for a style of combat that was evident to Portuguese explorers and visitors who visited Central Africa in the 1500s. This was called nsanga, which was a term for demonstrations of mock battles and combat. To the amazement of Portuguese observation, in combat, warriors were able to spin, jump, and dodge out of the way of projectiles and strikes against imaginary opponents to show loyalty to a lord to outshine their rivals in the praise of the ruler, which was always done before going on campaign. Father Lorenzo, a Capuchin missionary in the late 18th century, comments, then some of them commenced to sangare, that is to make contortions to demonstrate their force and their dexterity. The captains were covered with furs, armed with bows, swords, and hatchets. In the middle of them, Nzinga herself, with swords and spears, made spectacular demonstrations of her ability, and when the priest complimented her on this, she responded saying, "Sorry, father, because I am already old. But when I was young I yielded nothing to any jaga in ability, and in the ability to wound, such that I was not afraid to confront even a group of 25 armed soldiers, except if they had muskets, against which nothing will stop the destruction. But when against other weapons, that is where one can demonstrate one's courage, agility, and valor." This was also called sangwa by missionaries as a European derivative of nsanga. Pero Rodriguez, a missionary in Angola in the late 16th century, describes, "They do not have defensive arms. All their defense tests in sangwa, which is to jump from one place to another with 1,000 twists, and such agility that they can dodge arrows and arms, biluro, aimed at them. In the absence of defensive weapons, dodging was paramount to surviving the skirmishing phase in combat, where formations were very loose, the precursor to the hand-to-hand phase." A large number of slaves transported to the United States were warriors, who had been captured in combat and had been well versed in the traditions of Central and West African martial arts. With them came an amalgamation of Central and West African martial arts, such as Wall of Lamb, Igbo Ngba, or Yoruba Jidikbo, and side hold wrestling from that of the Bight of Biafra region, identified by its leg wrapping style, which became predominant in the United States for African Americans by the third generation, where Africans and their descendants were being outnumbered by the younger generation. Up until the 1970s, this style of wrestling was referred to as kicking a weep or just wrestling. On top of this, Ngolo tradition survived in the United States under knocking and kicking, a composite art that carried the techniques of foot fighting and headbutting practices from Central Africa, though the headbutting part was emphasized more. Nevertheless, kicking was still important and emulated Ngolo techniques, which included foot sweeps, cross steps, cutting an opponent off his feet, and standing foot sweeps. And both were trained separately, often integrated with other fighting styles like grappling. Due to the danger of these martial arts, slaves could often find themselves maroons, which were liberated slaves in a temporary state, bodyguards, soldiers, gladiators, and strongmen to slave owners, and part of organized games by white landowners who would get their slaves drunk and get them to fight each other. Slaves could also fight back against their masters if the punishment was seen as unjust, and often after would be left alone. Many, such as Frederick Douglass, who later won his freedom and toured Europe afterwards, commented on fighting a landowner who tried to beat him, and getting better conditions as a result. Like in Brazil with capoeira, knocking and kicking would be within closed societies, linked to Biafran African and prototype societies before the slave trade. They formed close societies amongst bondsmen, providing spiritual counseling, discussing relevant issues, and community leadership. More importantly, they perpetuated the old-time religion and utilized knocking and kicking and root doctoring, linking martial arts with medicine as a means of attaining power, as well as physical protection of elder religious figures. In these societies, knocking and kicking was performed in a clandestine meeting, referred to as drum meetings, which included ritual kicking contests and the continued inversion with the crossing of the water, which continued the old beliefs of the Kalunga. This also included tricknology, the art of trickery including knocking and kicking that contributed to the art of defense, which could also be a spiritual metaphor for overcoming obstacles of life in bondage. In knocking and kicking, the use of trickery was most evident in headbutting to overcome foes, and often was distinguished by a mutual charge from a distance. When fighting from a physical disadvantage, it meant striking a headbutt-style headblow to finish the fight before it began. As such, headbutts needed to be used at close range. Trickery was used to get close in, succeeding in knocking out any white troublemaker before their arms could be drawn. The use of fighting skills was not only limited to men, women were excluded from knocking and kicking, which was seen as a male activity. However, they participated fully in wrestling. African bondswomen carried a legacy of that linked womanhood to assertive action in the fields of agriculture, trade, and combat, being able to protect themselves at the hands of white aggressors and rapists. It was the fighting ability that exempted slaves from being beaten. For the slaves who came to work on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, life was often hard, labor-intensive, and back-breaking. Nevertheless, labor varied from midwives, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, etc. A high mortality rate was the norm for those who worked cutting the sugar cane. 24-hour workdays during the season was sometimes the norm, as sugar cane needed to be cut as soon as it was reaped. An alternative was military service in colonial militias or police forces. In this environment, in areas such as the French Lesser Antilles, the separation of open-handed and armed combat techniques coexisted. These were performed in the context of community performance rituals akin to the plays of North America, called calendas or bambulas, which referred specifically to the small drum of the dance circles. The dance circle was often accompanied by two drums, whose purpose was to improvise and respond to the dancer/fighter's movements. These were semi-private rituals conducted by associations, which combined ethnic, religious, and economic functions, serving purposes such as common fund for freedoms of members, funerals, and sponsoring community performance rituals, like on festival days. With these performances, the dances had specific religious implications, particularly when connected to certain ethnic groups. For example, in Martinique, the covert rituals may have been associated with the pugilistic arts. In any case, within this event, people were divided into separate circles representing a certain ethnic group, as well as one for Mustis, people of mixed European and African descent. This was also divided along the sexes. Women could claim honor through a personal display of dancing and the style of dress. This may have had a role in edging men on in their performance. In these circles, distinct manly exercises were given, including grappling set to music, which was a way for different African groups to express their own form of wrestling, such as Biafran ones with their Migba techniques. Stick fighting competitions were played, which Angolan Kuene men would have recognized. There were also headbutting duels. William Buttersworth, an English sailor who passed through Guadeloupe in 1787, described this as tupping, which was reminiscent of headbutting done in Angola. He writes, "Then they separate, withdrawing a few yards from each other, still dancing, jumping and nodding the head. Now stooping forwards, with hands clasped upon their back, they advance towards each other. When, with a yard and a half of each other, the music ceases, the tuppers pause for a moment, and eye each other with the steadfast gaze of scientific pugilists, when, as if by mutual impulse, both dart forwards, heads against heads, like two rams." Damier and Ladia fall into a type of pugilistic game that was known in the French Lesser Antilles as well as capoeira, which was a form of pugilism based on round haymaker-style swinging punches, taking on the form of a war of attrition in which both combatants' feet were touching each other. This is also referenced in Cuba with combat styles such as Mani. The other one was Bernaden, which was a slapboxing contest like that of the open-handed Kandenka. Unlike Okoye, blows were marked by a straight line trajectory, with the lips being a primary target. Damier was a form of kickboxing art, which according to Julian Gerstin were non-combat duels in which the contestant attempted to demonstrate their mastery without injury. Previously, at least one strain of this tradition was predominantly foot fights involving an exchange of aerobatic defenses, sweeps and kicks, the latter often thrown from an inverted position. Towards the 20th century, the lines between itself and the composite arts became blurry, as some punches were later introduced. The inverted kicks of the art were known as wolo, and were linked to the kulunga. Kicks would be delivered from a crouched position with the hands on the ground, in a ritual combat on land and an aquatic game involving a contest between two players in the ocean or river. According to Ed Powell, participants often attach weapons to their feet in contests and would flip themselves over to try and kick the opponent in the head or upper body with one or both feet in the aquatic context. As on land, the defense was to dodge or turn with the strike. This type of practice was done mainly on other islands, where it was known as libo. A relative composite art called ladia was created in Martinique, purportedly as a human variant on cockfighting. According to popular stories, Africans were used as gladiators for entertainment and gambling akin to fighting cocks. Therefore, the destructive side of the martial art may have been common in fights organized by planters, which was referred to as Ian Mo or Ladia de la Mort, Ladia of death, because it was reported participants would fight to the death. Often these practitioners, who were bondsmen, were used as overseers and people to police other slaves like in the USA. Even after abolition, these masters of Ladia were still referred to as major or major. Perhaps it is this life or death situation that caused an amalgamation of Damye Kokoye, Bernardin, the throws of Sauve Vaillant, and the headbutting or tapping. At times, it was not unknown for majors to hold razors in their feet to make their kicks more deadly. The result was a mixed martial arts form used to overcome any opponent, which survived to the 20th century when Vidyadhya Naipaul visited Martinique, who was taken to a place surrounded by seating for gambling and cockfighting, where Ladia fighters were bought in the evening. This style was practiced in the 20th century in sites that may have previously been marked by damier, taking place also at dance performances, on docks and festivals. In ritualistic contexts, Ladia took place in a circle of singers and fighters. It started by the Kuri Iawon, where the drums called a fighter to enter the circle in a stylized counterclockwise run. Then came the Monte Tanbu, in which he danced to the drummer, saluted the instruments, drew energy from them, and tried to intimidate his rival with the agility of the dance. After appraising the challenger's skill level, another adept would emerge from the circle and do the same. The two then faced each other and engaged in ritual combat, which included dancing to music while attacking and countering with kicks, evasions, sweeps, swinging hand blows, headbutts, throws, and cartwheels. The fight itself continued until the musicians called for it to be stopped, and then called another pair, starting with less experienced adepts and gradually increasing to the majors. Like Ungolo, it was believed that certain positions had Central African-derived religious ideas, e.g. the opening pose, the parada, standing with the left arm akimbo and the right hand outwards, believed to throw the spiritual power of the fighter against the opponent. This also applied to certain aspects such as the counterclockwise circle, which was used to evoke the ancestors who would watch over the Lagia fighters and offer them power which could be tapped into by the fighters themselves. This separated true master from practitioner like in Ungolo. All the moves derived from a pugilistic base, which, according to Catherine Dunham, lies not in the lust for combat, but in the finesse of approach and retreat, the tension which becomes almost a hypnosis, then the flash of the two bodies as they leap into the air, fall into a crouch and whirl at each other in simulated attacks, only to walk nonchalantly away, back to each other, showing utter indifference before falling again into the rocking motion which rests them physically but excites them emotionally. This quote from Catherine Dunham, Laja of Martinique, shows us a key aspect of Laja, the theatrical breaks and fating of disinterest in order to fool one's opponent and gain the element of surprise. The practice fostered trickiness and highlighted an entertaining exchange of attacks and counters. Though Ladia was a hybrid of styles, there had been no need to amalgamate them in the 18th century, and multiple combat arts existed side by side, playing unique roles in wake ceremonies in Guadeloupe, known as Veille Bukusu, and wake exercises. To the southern Angolans and Biafrans who were brought as captives to Brazil, slaves worked on sugar plantations in the Bahia and Pernambuco regions, but this was offset by the gold rush in Minas Gerais in 1690, which resulted in the growth of the port city Rio de Janeiro. A slave would find themselves in a thriving urban environment where the type of slavery differed to that of the chattel slavery in the USA and the Caribbean, though at times as benign. One could find themselves on sugar and coffee plantations, which marked low life expectancy. But in the city, bondsmen worked on construction, cleaned houses, unloaded cargo, delivered goods, produced crafts, and were factory workers. A household required the service of an African bondsman who brought water and carried away human waste. However, by the early 19th century, two-thirds of the city were of African descent, and this created new opportunities for finding new lineages, which had already been a tradition within West African Bantu culture. More importantly, like in the USA, many would have engaged in communal dances called batuques, based on Central African religious traditions of Colundus. Indeed, these were widespread in Rio. The Central African ritual specialists who directed these continued to invert themselves ritually in order to gain access to powers across the Kalunga. This, coinciding with the cosmological system that linked physical inversion to spiritual power, came the Angolan martial art that rose in Brazil. By the second half of the 18th century, the tradition of Ngolo had entrenched itself in Rio as the foundation of the jogo de capoeira, or the game of capoeira. The term described the art as a performance ritual and, like Ngolo, matches could be playful and graceful or rough and antagonistic, using circular kicks, push kicks, often inverted, sweeps, and acrobatic evasions. Like in the USA, this was practiced in various social situations like maroon communities, called quilombos, the most famous being Palmares, and police records show capoeira was used to rescue captured quilombolas, the Portuguese transformed term of quilombos. Like in the French Antilles, performance circles were common in evenings of Sunday and the holidays, dances often being called batuques. Local planters allowed these to occur as a mixture of repression and support. On the one hand, continuing the tradition, and on the other, continuing divisions of African peoples in Brazil to keep the enslaved from uniting as a single force. In Rio, dances could attract as many as 2,000 bondsmen, and each African people danced according to distinct aesthetic tastes but often had common features, with aspects such as undulating hips and bumping of midsections, like what's seen in Madagascar meringue. A French journalist was eager to comment on the process. I quote, "Here is capoeira, a series of combat dance, of daring and competitive spins to the sound of Congolese drum. There is the batuque, with its cold and lewd attitudes, which the urunkungo accelerates or slows. Beyond, it is a crazy dance, with the provocation of the eyes, of breasts and hips, a species of intoxicating convulsion that is called lundu. In these circles, adepts exhibited demonstrations of inverted kicks, sweeps, and acrobatic defenses set to percussive instruments. As well as ritual, capoeira was performed in the city, such as for entertainment for sailors, tavern patrons, and large crowds during public and religious processions. Also in informal situations, such as temporary breaks from labor, a way to pass the time in the day while waiting for work, and as a form of combat in street fights. Like in the USA, there was a growth of closed societies, however these were entirely urban, and the colonial authorities were occupied with exterminating these groups who had stood in defiance of the slave system. Societies, coining names like maltas, confraria, paternas, ranchos, or grupos de capoeira, may have grown out of ethnic-based associations in the city, with capoeira and battles, where different ethnic groups engaged in, and I quote, feuds and combats where one or even 200 of a nation on each side are engaged. End quote. Identities were in association with symbols, e.g. Catholic brotherhoods would associate with particular saints, with an elected king and queen who sponsored dances and played crucial roles in African burials. The nature was of a closed society and shared many of the functions brotherhoods and cantosts also faced, being referred to as gangs. And though there is often overlapping similarities, the nature was more along the lines of secret societies in the sense members claimed mastery of a special knowledge, being martial arts. In many ways, these were similar to paramilitary societies. For example, paramilitary leopard societies called ekpe were only open to those who had proven themselves in battle and included a graded society with levels of initiation that played various roles such as trade, artistic development, and law enforcement. This also included economic, judicial, and political roles, tapping the leopard's lethal grace for authority through artistic and paramilitary power, artistic power through emblems such as hats, combat, and literacy, holding occasional public dances to entertain the community and display grace in ritual functions, making and keeping of law, enforcing legal codes, and enactment of secret vengeance through preemptive launched attacks against enemies, murder, collecting fines from people who transgress social norms, and punishing internal offenders and external enemies. Often, Biafra used knives to kill their victims in the way that mimicked leopard attacks. James Wetherell, who visited Brazil in 1856, described capoeira as a foot fight. He says, and I quote, "A kick on the shins is about the most powerful knock they give each other. They are full of action, capering and throwing their arms and legs about like monkeys during their quarrels." End quote. Circular kicks, pushing kicks, sweeps, and inverted kicks can be distinguished from the latter half of the 19th century, with inverted kicks such as the rabo de araya and pentana. For example, the rabo de araya was a kick launched according to Filho in Festas as, and I quote, "one of the most rudimentary foundational movements," end quote, which was launched by, and I quote, "turning over the body, rotating one of the legs to kick the enemy," end quote. The pentana involved, and I quote, "turning over the body, applying both feet against the chest of the adversary," end quote. Though these initially had religious connotations such as channeling spirits, they remained the aesthetic basis of capoeira. It is these aspects which drew crowds of observers, as well as the use of acrobatics to engage in defense against kicks. This was by keeping the body in constant motion with dance-like steps, which became known as the ginga, which came from the Congo and Ngila languages of Angola to mean to dance, sway, or play. With this as a deceptive form of footwork, these would set the basis for dodging techniques including ducking low under an attack, simultaneously being defensive, and counterattacks, such as the cacador, where the dancer would drop low on his hands to avoid a blow and extend one leg out to sweep the opponent's support leg, which would send him to the ground. Like in the USA with knocking and kicking, headbutts may have played a role. Johann Moritz Rugendas, who travelled to Brazil in the early 1820s, illustrates this. He says, and I quote, "The Negroes have another, much fiercer war game, the jogar capoeira. Two champions rush at each other, trying to strike with his head at the chest of the opponent he is aiming to knock down. The attack is thwarted by leaping sideways or by equally skillfully parrying. But in springing at each other, pretty much like goats, they now and again butt each other's heads very roughly, so no one often sees jesting give place to anger, with the result that the sport is made bloody with blows and even with knives." End quote. While these techniques were associated with rituals and in bloody street battles, it's difficult to establish whether there was any integration with the jogo de capoeira. The possibility is that Rugendas conflated ritualized head dueling, mentioned in police records as jogo de cabecadas, as separate as it had been in the USA and the French Antilles. Though the jogo de capoeira served as an exercise, in times of conflict capoeiras called on capoeiragem, a form of fighting skills that was distinct from the jogo in its wider variety, relying on headbutts, weapons, and other injury-inflicting maneuvers. Although kicks were frequently used, headbutts were the most widely mentioned technique in police registries, being noted as the, quote, "principal weapon of capoeira," end quote. An English visitor to Rio early in the 19th century noted, he says, and I quote, "For the office of assassin, the very lowest order of Negroes are hired. Their manner of setting to work is worthy of remark. They need no stiletto, birdcage owl, the term for this used is ferro di gaiola, or any other weapon. In lieu of these, they only use the head, and with it they butt like balls at the chest of their victim. I saw a field officer who had been murdered in this manner and thrown over the wall into his garden, where his family found him in the morning. The upper part of his body had been flattened, as if the implement of death had been a mallet. End quote. Kicking in Rio seems to be the property of trained specialists, while headbutting existed as more of a widespread form of combat among the black population. The importance of headbutts also depended on the angle of the blow and target. For example, the caveira no espelho, skull in a mirror, was a standing headbutt to the face, while the cocada was an upward strike under the chin. The 19th century included a wider variety of arsenal. In heated combat, other moves included punching and wrestling, which is where the origin of a few hand strikes may have came from, as well as anti-blade techniques of espada, which used a circular kick to knock a knife from an opponent's hand, or suicidio, which kicked an opponent's legs out, causing him to cut himself with his own blade. The use of weapons as a second skill, though unarmed fighting, remained the core of the jogo de capoeira, especially after the creation of the Royal Guard Police. Knives, sticks, razors, and rocks were widely adopted in response to the arming of police carrying shrimp dinners, a reference to severe cudgeling of unarmed individuals with heavy clubs that had rawhide strips on them to act as a club and a whip. The easiest weapon to acquire was the stick, which was central to Central and West African traditions and expressed/practiced through ludic stick fighting dances. Rocks were also highly dangerous as arms, used to attack sentinels and targets of crowds. Knives and navajas, folding knives and razors, were also the other main weapons, coming from Kimbebassian and Iberian blade work, or even the tradition of knife fighting from the far northern region of Angola. There was the European style of cloak and dagger fighting, but the most common blade among African capoeiras in the first half of the 19th century was a knife called a soveleo, and was recorded to be hurled with tremendous effect and with irresistible force, and driven at a considerable distance through a thick deal board. It's important to note that many sailors, black, Portuguese or not, were exposed to African combat traditions, enticing many to live with Africans or unite with them in acts of militancy. In the Caribbean, sailors often sought out bondsmen in dances both to observe and in martial games. In Brazil and Trinidad, many of the same restaurants, taverns, and brothels were frequented by sailors as they were by Trinidadian stick fighters and Rio capoeiras. Many white sailors may have gained experience of African combat traditions in street fights with colored people or as a member of working class audiences who flocked to foot fights and other combative displays. Sailors indeed may have got private viewings, as black dock workers in Martinique's and Brazil's port areas were well known for entertaining them with damier/laja and jogo de capoeira matches.